At the beginning of 1918, Ludendorff and Hindenburg still believed that Germany could win the war for their Kaiser. They had survived the Somme and Ypres, forced Russia to surrender and imposed a favourable peace in the east, but morale at home was collapsing under the strain of food shortages caused by the Allies' naval blockade after the failure to defeat the Royal Navy at Jutland. And they also had to factor in the wavering support that they could expect from Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. The generals also knew that American strength was beginning to tell heavily against them. So they resolved that their best chance of victory was to strike first and to strike hard. On the 21st of March 1918, the Germans launched Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, a full-scale assault against British positions near the Somme. Taken by surprise, British forces fell back as German divisions, using new stormtrooper tactics, with small assault groups detecting and then attacking weak points on the Allied line. Haig issued a request of the French to shore up the front, but Pétain refused, fearing that Paris itself was the true target after German long-range guns shelled the capital from 60 miles away. This clash again revealed the cracks in the Allied command structure that had been present since the summer of 1914, but the threat now was so severe that in April it was agreed to appoint Marshal Ferdinand Foch as commander-in-chief. Foch then countermanded Pétain and ordered that French reinforcements be sent to the Somme, where the German advance soon lost momentum. A second German push came in April in Flanders to the north. Gains were quick, and the Messines Ridge, taken by Canadian troops in 1917, was lost. But the breakthrough to the Channel ports never came, and the Allies' supply line remained intact. In the meantime, thousands of American troops were now arriving every day. At the end of May, a third offensive swept forward 40 miles to the Marne. For a moment, Paris seemed within reach, but American troops under General Pershing stood firm, and together with French divisions, they halted the advance. By June, German momentum had gone, and the Allies counterattacked across the front. The final desperate assault came on the 15th of July at the Second Battle of the Marne. This time, Allied reconnaissance spotted the build-up, and their artillery tore into the attackers. French and American troops held the line, and by now over 300,000 US troops were arriving every month. The tide of the war had turned. In August, Foch and other Allied commanders planned a series of coordinated offensives against an exhausted German army, whose morale was collapsing with mutinies spreading in the ranks. These offensives were to continue until the Armistice ended hostilities on the 11th of November. On the 8th of August, the Battle of Amiens began, with British, Australian and Canadian troops breaking through German lines in the north almost at will. To the south, they were supported by the French, who took 5 miles of land on that first day alone. Ludendorff was later to describe this day, the 8th of August, perhaps the most decisive day of 1918, with demoralized German troops surrendering in their thousands, as the Black Day of the German army. Through the rest of August, the Allied offensives gathered pace, with the rout continuing into September. This included the first major US-led offensive of the war, commanded by General Pershing and involving the newly formed American First Army, at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, just to the south of Verdun. Over 550,000 US troops, supported by French units, were involved in the short and decisive victory between the 12th and the 15th of September that recaptured ground that had been in German hands since 1914. Slowly but relentlessly, all these Allied offensives were driving back the enemy towards the Hindenburg Line and beyond. With the war going well on the Western Front, it was also to reach its conclusion in the skies and at sea. In 1915, the Germans had gained the upper hand in the fight for aerial superiority by developing a synchronized machine gun that allowed the pilot to fire forwards through the propeller. This gave birth to the modern fighter pilot, the most famous of which was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. He became the scourge of the Allies, shooting down 80 planes before he himself was killed in April 1918. In the same month, Britain created the RAF, the Royal Air Force, uniting its various air corps into a single independent service. By 1918, the war had evolved from reconnaissance and observation to dogfights and bombing raids on enemy trenches and supply depots, and this too was a war that the Allies were winning. At sea, German admirals planned one last great battle against the Royal Navy, but in October 1918, sailors at Kiel refused to sail. The Kiel Mutiny led to other insurrections, sparking a wider revolution across the whole country. After the Armistice, orders were given for the Kaiserliche Marine, the German High Seas Fleet, commanded by Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, and manned by about 20,000 German sailors, to be sailed to Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, where they sat at anchor, awaiting their fate for 7 long months. On the 21st of June 1919, hearing rumours of what was going on in Paris, von Reuter issued a secret order wanting to deny the Allies one last time and preserve the Imperial Navy's honour in defeat. This order to scuttle their ships was followed by 52 out of the 74 captains under his command. As a result, crews opened seacocks before abandoning ship, with the bulk of the German Imperial Navy sinking in a matter of minutes to the bottom of the icy ocean. At the beginning of October 1918, Prince Max of Baden, Germany's new chancellor, had written to President Wilson asking for an armistice based on the president's 14 points. This was Wilson's blueprint for a post-war world that he had outlined in an address to Congress in January 1918. However, Allied commanders and politicians, including Wilson, insisted that any settlement would not be negotiated while the Kaiser and his generals remained in charge. As a result, Ludendorff had resigned as commander-in-chief of the German army on the 26th of October. But negotiations had hardly begun in the early days of November, when riots and mutinies broke out all over Germany, which was proclaimed a republic on the 9th of November. A day later, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands, where he was to live in exile until his death in June 1941, only a few weeks before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, a German civilian delegation arrived in France to negotiate terms with Marshal Foch, and on the 11th of November 1918, armistice terms were agreed. Thus, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, hostilities officially ceased. But this was not to come before a short and horrific final microcosm of the whole war was to play out. At 5 a.m., the armistice papers were signed in Foch's railway carriage in the Compiègne forest. But the terms allowed for 6 more hours of fighting, with the war set to end at 11 a.m. In that brief but brutal window, some 2,700 men were killed, mostly Allied soldiers, with commanders ordering attacks right up to the ceasefire, wanting to gain ground or secure favourable positions in the final hours. Poignantly, records revealed that the last Allied soldiers to be killed in the Great War were a Canadian, Private George Price of the 28th Battalion at 10:58, and an American, Private Henry Gunter of the 313th Infantry at 10:59, both killed just seconds before the guns were due to fall silent. 22 years later, the same carriage was placed in the same siding and surrounded by the flags and paraphernalia of the Nazi state. It was to be in this same carriage that the French representatives were made to officially accept the surrender of France after the Nazi blitzkrieg of May and June 1940. The armistice demanded the unconditional surrender of Germany and the evacuation of contested territory. In particular, this meant that Alsace and Lorraine were to be immediately returned to France. By this time, Allied ships had steamed through the Dardanelles, anchoring just off Istanbul, with hostilities having also ended in Italy and the Balkans. On the 25th of November, the Great War was finally to end, with the surrender of a German guerrilla force of some 3,000 at Abercorn in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. This formally brought an end to the hostilities that had plagued the world since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914. In total, some 65 million men were involved in the fighting that killed 10 million and wounded a further 8. It is said that World War I was to be the war that ended all wars. However, just 21 years later, an even more ferocious and costly one was to break out between many of the same belligerents. The Paris Peace Conference was convened at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris on the 18th of January 1919. Delegates from 70 nations attended, but neither Germany nor Bolshevik Russia were invited. The big three, Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George, dominated, with Orlando of Italy playing a lesser role. From the outset, two questions dominated: how to stop another war and what to do with Germany. The first led to plans for the League of Nations. On Germany, though, there was to be less agreement. Wilson urged fairness, while Clemenceau, scarred by invasions of his country twice in his lifetime, and Lloyd George, who promised to squeeze Germany until the pipsqueak, pressed for harsher terms. Their view prevailed when the treaty's severity became clear. Among the many clauses of the formal document, 4 stood out in particular. Firstly, Germany's military was to be emasculated. Its army was cut to 100,000, its navy restricted, it was banned from having an air force, and the Rhineland was demilitarized for 15 years. Secondly, it lost land. Alsace and Lorraine were already returned to France. Belgium and Poland gained land. Danzig became a free city, and all of its colonies were taken away. Thirdly, reparations were demanded of the German state, with an Allied council charged with determining the finite amount after calculating the cost of the war to the Allies. But fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, Clause 231, the War Guilt Clause, placed sole blame for the war on Germany and the Kaiser, making all the other terms seem justified. Hebert denounced the terms as a portrayal of Wilson's 14 points, yet famine and blockade left Germany powerless to resist. Many called for rejection, even war, but exhaustion made it impossible. So on the 28th of June 1919, 5 years to the day after Sarajevo, Hermann Müller, the German foreign minister, and Johannes Bell, the colonial minister, signed the treaty in the Hall of Mirrors on behalf of the German nation. Other treaties at the same time dismantled the empires of Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottomans, creating new states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and a reborn Poland. As delegates left Paris in the summer of 1919, they contemplated a world of unimaginable change. The map of Europe had been redrawn, with empires that had ruled for hundreds of years torn apart, with new states created in their place. However, many of the old grievances of 1914 remained. Germany signed the treaty under protest, humiliated by blame and reparations, while civil war in communist Russia would eventually lead to victory of the Red Army and Bolshevism. The United States withdrew from the old world fights it only reluctantly joined in 1917, with President Harding, Wilson's successor, calling for isolationism. This left Britain and France, both deeply affected by the war, to organize and police the newly formed League of Nations and the international community. The treaties left the continent brittle, unstable, and haunted by the war, with the peace only an uneasy pause before another storm. Perhaps some felt The war to end all wars was not, in truth, ended at all.